Just what exactly is Putin's endgame? Asked in February what Putin's endgame is, most people would have simply answered that it was to take Ukraine. As the botched invasion has dragged on for months, though, it's looked more and more difficult for Putin to find a way out while saving face not just for Russia, but also himself. Days before the war, Putin enjoyed widespread support from citizens who initially supported the invasion, and military analysts the world over expected Ukraine's military to be up against a much stronger enemy. Now, Putin is looking at a completely different chessboard, though. His support at home is falling by the wayside, and his military results have been mostly embarrassing for months. If he were to give up and retreat from Ukraine now, he would have just plummeted the standing of himself and Russia for no gain at all. For someone as egotistical as Putin, this doesn't seem like an outcome he'd be happy with. So, what exactly is Putin going to do to make all of this time, money, and blood worth it in his eyes? He'll need some sort of results to show the Russian people before peace can ever be announced, and Moscow has already sunk so much into the war effort that everyone from military commanders to politicians will at least want some territory that they can take to the negotiating table. So, just what exactly is Putin's endgame? In Putin's ideal world, Ukraine would have fallen hours from the beginning of the invasion. At the beginning of the war, the Kremlin was justifying the special military operation with the so-called denazification of Ukraine. But anyone who doesn't live off RT News knows that there's no chance that it will stop there. In fact, chances are that if Russia does manage to take hold of all of Ukraine, there won't be any attempt at denazification in any form at all. If Russia cared so much about right-wing extremists, they would have dealt with their own massive skinhead problem at home rather than galvanize the small subsections of extremists in Ukraine by declaring a crazy war. So, no. Normal people in Ukraine won't even benefit from some attempt to cull radicals in the country. Putin's main goal, which everything else will fall in line for, will be to install a government that is loyal to Russia. The increasingly close relations between Ukraine, the EU, and NATO since the Maidan coup have been the driving force of Moscow's hostility towards their westerly neighbors. They just cannot stand to see Kiev growing closer to Brussels and Washington. Before the Maidan coup in 2012, when Ukraine's president had a balanced approach to the East and West, possibly even favoring Russia, there was no chance of a Russian invasion. Now that Russia knows it's lost that tug-of-war on the diplomatic front, the thing that matters to them most is winning that prize through military means. We have already seen the annexed parts of eastern Ukraine that elected officials have just simply been replaced with puppets, subservient to Russia. They dance exactly how Moscow wants them to, and in Putin's dream, Kiev will do exactly the same. Making this happen in central and western Ukraine will be a very different story from implementing it in the country's east, though. Many people in the east of Ukraine look fondly at Russia, and so the resistance is not always so widespread when Russian influence and interference are felt in the government. The further west that you go in Ukraine, though, the more of a fight people will put up at having these puppets imposed on them. Putin's ideal end plan would just be to plonk a subservient politician in place and control them from back in Moscow. But Russia's troops are probably going to have to stay behind if they want to have any hope of quelling the inevitable unrest that a Russian regime change would bring. Putin would also have to look at the new global order once he accomplished any goals in Ukraine, too. If he were to remove the current Ukrainian government, NATO's hostility to Moscow would undoubtedly ramp up even further. In the crazy world of Putin's mind, this might be a navigable geopolitical situation for Russia. If he were to look at it as optimistically as possible, it could be reasoned that the West will give up on being so angry once Ukraine has fallen. After all, the huge numbers of sanctions and trade embargoes are hurting economies in the West as well as the economy of Russia. Putin could be banking on a high perception of his own diplomatic ability to firmly place Russia back in a strong negotiating position. The West can't hide how much it's been struggling whilst trying to wean itself off of Russia's natural resources such as oil and natural gas. Russia's dictator will be hoping he can lure the rest of Europe to the negotiating table by announcing the war is over for certain, and so people might as well get back to trading. As depressing as it may be for the Ukrainians, we've seen before that economic opportunity can be irresistible for Western leaders, even if they are legitimately outraged about the Russian invasion at the moment. If they are persuaded that Ukraine won't be independent again anytime soon, then it's perfectly feasible that they're lured back to the negotiating table to start enjoying relatively cheap Russian resources again. So, a subservient puppet Ukraine and Western countries that come crawling back for trade, that's Putin's ideal endgame. But how likely is it to play out like that? Sure, there might be elements that turn out just the way Moscow would like, but there's just as much that could go wrong too. As the war drags on, Putin's got to start giving more attention to his own personal endgame at home as much as Russia's endgame on the global stage. Even with all the propaganda that is shoved down the throats of everyday Russians, public opinion is starting to turn against the Kremlin. Support for the war was initially high, but the burden it started to place on the economy and the wildly unpopular enlistments have got people wondering if Putin could soon start having a power struggle on his hands back home. Dictators escaping from situations like this can get sticky, to say the least. Those who retire early can find it hard to dodge the repercussions of the law once the new generation of politicians crack down on the years of corruption and nepotism. Putin has recently watched this play out in Kazakhstan, and so will be worried whether it's too late for him to step down now. On the other hand, desperately holding on to power for longer than he's welcome can end in even bloodier ways. It doesn't matter what his plans are for Russia if he can barely keep the Russian people and rebellious politicians from breaking down the doors of the Kremlin. If any of Putin's grand plans for the world stage are to work out, he also has to play a careful balance of still appealing to the Russian people. His endgame can only take place if he's still in power in Moscow after all. As crazy as it may seem to many in the West, Putin often scores very highly in Russia's approval ratings, but that doesn't mean it'll last forever. The dictator is going to need to have a precise game plan laid out for his survival at home if he wants to see through his endgame for Russia on the world stage too. So, what happens if he starts losing support at home? He might be forced to whimper back and try to make it up to the West and settle for something short of his initial dreams, if he's to hold on to power in Russia and not plunge the country towards imploding completely. There's no denying that the invasion of Ukraine has been a disaster. The army's initial movements were those of a force that expected the battle to be over in a number of weeks, if not days. The war effort so far has fallen far short of its goals. The idea that Russia could capture all of Ukraine and put a puppet government in power isn't completely impossible, but looks extremely unlikely unless something happens in the coming weeks. It's not even looking certain that Russia will be able to hold on to the parts of Ukraine that they annexed and held referendums in. When a leader makes a bet as big as Putin did and it goes this terribly wrong, there comes a point where it becomes more important to try and recuperate some of the losses. Putin probably thinks that he's going to need to have something to show for the war effort if he's going to convince the Russian people that the tanking of the economy and the global isolation were worth it. Since so many Russian citizens were initially supportive of the war, it's reasonable to believe that they'd be satisfied if Putin could bring troops home having successfully annexed and held on to parts of Ukraine. At some point, if the invasion continues on for too long, Russia will have to admit that winning total control of Ukraine is just not feasible. At this point, the endgame becomes about how well peace could be negotiated in Russia's favor. There will almost certainly be an insistence from Putin that Russia holds on to many of the Russian-speaking parts of Ukraine where referendums were held in September. Putin will also probably insist on the EU and NATO turning down the volume on its trade attacks, insisting that normalization of relations and peace means Russia's companies, institutions, and politicians have the right to trade without interference. Putin's endgame, therefore, relies very much on how much the West is willing to play hardball or fall in line. On one hand, if Ukraine continues to be filled with weapons and support from the West, Russia may be more happy to cut its losses and go back home with its tail between its legs, not expecting to hold on to much territory. On the other hand, seeing so much NATO support could just send Russia into more of a frenzy, just as it did at the beginning of the war. The paranoia that NATO is pushing east through Ukraine towards Russia's border is still waiting there to be stoked. And if the West doesn't manage it carefully, Putin could insist that Russia holds on to as much of Ukraine as possible so they will have a buffer zone. The West will also have a tough time trying to influence Putin's endgame when it comes to trade and international relations once peace is agreed to. If they try to offer a warm reception and drop sanctions, Putin might take it as a sign of encouragement that violence is an effective way to get concessions out of the West. Alternatively, if the West is too cold, then Putin won't see the benefit of maneuvering for peace, and so his endgame could be to continue with the war effort and finish the job they started. Unfortunately for the people of Ukraine and the leaders in the West, trying to manage Putin's endgame is trying to manage a maniac's endgame. We can see what his aims and goals are, but it's almost impossible to predict exactly how he might react to any move. In short, Putin's ideal endgame is to continue his dictatorship over Russia, secure Ukraine for his own, and force the West to come to the negotiating table. In reality, he could very well end up juggling a rebellious citizenry and usurper politicians at home, desperately holding on to small pieces of territory in Ukraine and being forced into a corner by the West playing hardball. Exactly which way things will go will depend on exactly how mad he is.